I'm Linus. Welcome to Kids Talk Church History, a one-of-a-kind podcast where kids investigate the history of the church. Over 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." Has he kept his promise? How has Jesus built and preserved his church against all odds? Come with us on a trip through history to find the answer, here on Kids Talk Church History.
We have devoted a few episodes to the difficult questions and doubts Christians had to face in the 18th and 19th centuries. But there was also another challenge. The Industrial Revolution brought much progress, but created greater poverty and harsh living conditions for the workers, and the church could not look away. A man who led the church in a program of relief for the poor was the Scottish pastor Thomas Chalmers. Stay with us as we learn more about his life and work here at Kids Talk Church History. I'm Linus, I'm 15, and I live in San Diego, California.
I'm Grace, I am 13, and I live in Raleigh, North Carolina.
My name is Sean, I am 14, and I live in Augusta, Kansas. So, quick question. What is the Industrial Revolution?
Well, it was a period of big changes when the world switched from making things by hand to making them with machines and factories. It completely changed the lives of many people. It brought progress, but also poverty.
But how could something so beneficial also bring progress and poverty?
Well, there was progress for people who owned the factories and for people who could afford to buy their products, but there was poverty for the workers because they were not paid very much and had to live in crowded and unhealthy places. Charles Dickens wrote about that.
Ah, yes, with Oliver Twist saying, "Please, sir, can I have more?"
Yeah, many churches helped the poor, but Thomas Chalmers is remembered because his program was one of the largest in Europe. Besides helping the poor, he started a school to help people to get an education and better jobs.
He was a Scottish pastor, right?
Yeah, and although I read that he didn't really feel called by God when he started out, he chose to become a pastor because it was a stable occupation.
Well, I guess he changed.
Yeah, he understood the gospel. He said, "I am now most thoroughly of the opinion that on the system, do this and live, no peace can ever be found in it. It is believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt be saved."
That is the difference between law and the gospel.
Exactly. The law says, do this and live, but that's really impossible without Christ. The gospel tells us what Christ has done for us, and Chalmers believed that the gospel could change the world around us by changing the hearts of the people. He believed it so much that the city of Glasgow, where he was a pastor, put him in charge of the funds for the relief of the poor, and he was able to prove that when people understand what Christ has done for them, they are more willing to help others.
Was he in the Church of Scotland?
Yes, but the Church of Scotland had lots of problems. We had another episode about that, with the Marrow Men starting a new denomination in 1733. Thomas Chalmers made a similar separation in 1843, with 1/3 of the Scottish ministers following him. The new denomination was called the Free Church, and the division became known as the Disruption.
It must have been a difficult decision.
Yeah, it's always hard to leave a church, especially when you know that many people will stay there in spite of the problems. In this case, it was also hard because the Church of Scotland received money from the state, and all the pastors who moved away lost their source of income, but they believed it was worth it. There's a lot more to say about Thomas Chalmers, but we need to let our expert tell us all that. He is Sandy Finlayson, library director and professor of theological bibliography at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. Before this, he served as an elder in the Toronto congregation of the Free Church of Scotland for 10 years. He has written 2 books on Thomas Chalmers. Dr. Finlayson, thank you so much for joining us.
Very good to be here. Thank you for having me on your podcast. One thing I should just correct, and that is that I'm actually retired from my job at Westminster. I've been retired for a couple of years. But I'm very glad to be here and very happy to talk about Thomas Chalmers, who did so much for the kingdom of God in Scotland and around the world.
So besides your title, in our conversation about Thomas Chalmers, did we get anything wrong or something you'd like to correct?
No, that's complete. You've got it all right.
Okay. Could you explain a little more about his program for the poor and how it was unique?
You mentioned in your introduction the problems caused by the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. In Glasgow, where Thomas Chalmers would serve in two different parish churches between 1815 and 1823, relief for the poor had been the responsibility of four different groups. The churches, where relief was managed by the minister and elders, the town council, and then the incorporated trades and the merchant's house, which were connected to the business interests. Eventually, these four groups began working together more closely under the direction of a board of management led by the Lord Provost of Glasgow. But charity dispensed by these groups and private citizens was insufficient at a time when the population was growing and the number of the poor was increasing. So what was required was a church committed to the preaching of the life-changing gospel and a totally reinvigorated church eldership and diaconate who would be actively looking for those in need. Further, Chalmers told the congregations in Glasgow that the church needed to be intentionally generous in giving to the poor. And then lastly, the church needed to invest in education for the poor so that they would be better equipped for the work. During his pastorates in Glasgow, Chalmers believed strongly that a properly functioning church could meet the needs of the poor. It is important to note, though, that his views would change during his lifetime. After he left Glasgow and went on to other spheres of service, there were widespread famines that broke out in 1845 and 1846. And he came to the conclusions that the problems were just too big for the church to deal with on their own. And so he called for the government to get more involved in terms of providing more funds and also doing more coordination of relief for the poor. And he actually called for increased taxes on the wealthy to help those who are suffering. So those are the basics. From our perspective here in the 21st century, I think the thing that is the biggest takeaway for us is the idea that he felt that he believed strongly that the church had an obligation to those who were less fortunate.
I really resonated with what you said, especially about giving generously. And I totally agree with Thomas Chalmers because back when I was a kid, my dad told me a story about when he started going to church, that he didn't know whether to give 10% of the gross or the net of his paycheck. And so eventually his pastor came to him and said, give whatever you feel obligated to give. It's not a fine line of you give this much or you give this much. It's how much God calls you to give. Chalmers understood the gospel only after he became a preacher. How did that happen?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Back in the 19th century, if you grew up in sort of a middle class home like the one that he did, the sort of spheres of work that were open to you, where you could go into the military, you could go into the legal profession, or you could go into the church. And the church was seen as a very respectable sphere of work. And so he decided that he would pursue ministry, not because he felt compelled to preach the gospel, but because he thought he could make a good living and be seen as respectable in the eyes of the world. He gets educated for the ministry and begins his first parish work in a little place called Kilmeny. And then between 1809 and 1811, a series of things happen which would have a major impact on him. He would go from viewing his ministry as a means to having a successful, comfortable life, but his priorities would change. He, at this point, was reflecting views that he'd learned at St. Andrews University, where he'd gone to school. But he would soon undergo a real change of heart that altered his life. In early June of 1809, he becomes very ill with consumption. He gets sick. And the disease had already claimed the lives of one of his sisters and one of its brothers. And contemporary reports say that the loss of a brother and a sister, as well as his own illness, really gave him pause for thought. He'd been very close to his siblings, and his 19th century contemporary biographer says that their deaths caused him to reflect more seriously about a dimension of life which, by his own admission, he had not fully considered. By April of 1810, he was sufficiently recovered from his illness that he was able to return to his family home. And there he has additional things happen to him in his life. He had been engaged to a woman by the name of Anne Rankin, and his engagement collapsed. And then another sister dies of consumption in December of 1810. So he's really in a place of personal crisis and turmoil. As he's dealing with his grief, he begins reading a book by William Wilberforce called A Practical View of the Prevailing Religious System of Professed Christians. And this book is full of very warm evangelical piety. And in fact, you quoted Chalmers' response to the book, and it changed his view of Christianity, where he said that the system of belief which says do this and live will not provide any peace, and only believing in the Lord Jesus Christ will change your life. And he embraced that. That was the point in his life where the Lord turned his life upside down. And so from having come from a place where he viewed his work as a minister as being essentially a profession, a job, it then became working very much for the Lord. And it changed. If you read his sermons, you can tell that there's a massive switch in both the content and the tone of his sermons that takes place at this period in his life. So previously, he had preached sort of very moralistic lectures on how to be a good citizen, and now his sermons are full of the gospel. So the Lord used a series of very real events in his life: sickness, death of family members, and then William Wilberforce's book to change him. And the change was remarkable in his life.
Totally, 100%. Like, we're all oriented differently. I see that every day when I open up my Bible and I continue to read certain passages. Like, although it's as simple as you follow the law and you will live, we as humans cannot wholly follow the law. That's why Jesus came to die on the cross for us. Like, he gives us grace and he gives us love, so that we can do the things through Jesus that we could never do on our own. And that's just beautiful.
Yes, yes, indeed.
We talked a little about the disruption of 1843, but can you give us more details about why it was necessary?
Okay. The Church of Scotland, after the Reformation, was a established church. It had a direct link to the state, and in doing this, it was following what had been put forth in the Westminster Confession of Faith, where the Westminster Assembly believed that the church and the state should work together for the good and the advance of the gospel. What develops in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th century is this. You have parishes in Scotland where either the local town council, who is responsible for the church, or the landowner want to exercise their rights, as they saw it, to appoint the parish minister. And the Westminster Assembly the Westminster Confession is very clear that while there should be a link between the church and the state, the church should be spiritually independent. And so what had been happening was that there were sort of increased pressure on the church to allow local landowners, local town councils to appoint the ministers in the various parishes in Scotland. And those who were more evangelical in their approach to the gospel saw this as a real problem and wanted to maintain the spiritual independence of the church. And after his conversion, Thomas Chalmers becomes part of the group who are essentially struggling for the spiritual independence of the church. And in the period, in the sort of 10 years or so before 1843, there were a series of court cases where the whole issue of who could appoint a parish minister was litigated in court. And there were a whole series of sort of contradictory, confusing judgments that had come from those courts. And ultimately, it became very clear that the church was not going to be able to maintain its spiritual independence. And so that's why, in very broad strokes, the disruption happened. Chalmers, it's important to know, believed firmly in the establishment principle. He believed firmly that there should be a link between the church and the state. But what he was very clear on is that the church needed to be spiritually independent. The church should be able to preach the gospel without interference, without being told what it should preach. The church should be able to dispense the sacraments without interference. It should be allowed to exercise church discipline when necessary without interference. And most importantly, it should be able to select their own pastors. So that's essentially what happened. You mentioned in the introduction that about a third of the ministers of the Church of Scotland left during the disruption. One of the more remarkable things that happened is that all of the foreign missionaries that were connected with the Church of Scotland joined the Free Church. which meant that the church had a very outward-focused approach to ministry, that they were um, very concerned about the proclamation of the gospel around the world. So that gives you a bit of background on why it was important. And Chalmers becomes the leader of the evangelical group within the Church of Scotland, who will eventually form the Free Church.
Great. So I have some questions for my older sister, Emma. Our listeners probably remember her. She was a host here for quite some time. She really wanted to be here for this episode because she loves Thomas Chalmers, but she had some other engagements. So one of her questions was about Chalmers' lectures on astronomy. Why did he hold those?
Yeah, those sermons really captured the public's imagination. They were preached between November 1815 and October 1816. They were preached in Glasgow and were part of a series that was intended for businessmen and people in the professional classes who worked in Glasgow. Each of the Church of Scotland clergymen in the city took turns delivering the sermons. Chalmers' selection became known as the Astronomical Discourses. And they make use of Chalmers' considerable scientific knowledge and its interest in natural philosophy. And in these lectures, sermons, he demonstrates that the Christian faith had nothing to fear from modern science. He was anxious to demonstrate that it was possible for a minister, an ordinary Christian, to be an evangelical and also have considerable knowledge of the worlds of philosophy and science. And they were essentially a response to society's growing awareness of the vastness of the universe and the claim that said that Christianity was implausible, and especially the belief that the death of Christ on earth could somehow redeem humanity from sin. So rather than being daunted by these challenges against Christianity, Chalmers very persuasively makes the case that the death and resurrection of Jesus were in fact God's way of bringing the whole universe back into relationship with God. And there was a hugely positive response to these sermons. They were published shortly after they were preached, and within 10 weeks, 6,000 copies had been sold. And within the first year of them being published, there were more than 20,000 copies sold. So they had a huge impact.
Okay, what influence did Thomas Chalmers have on future generations, either in Scotland or outside of Scotland?
In his lifetime, he was responsible for a major change in the direction of the Scottish Church in terms of the formation of the Free Church and the growth of evangelical preaching in the church. He was considered one of the greatest preachers of his day, and many of his sermons still have the capacity to really enlighten, challenge, and inspire us. He helped motivate and train a whole generation of students, many of whom went on to do significant work around the world. And I've already mentioned the fact that every single foreign missionary left to join the Free Church. His efforts on behalf of the poor and underprivileged, I think, changed the way that the church looked at the poor. He reawakened the church to an awareness of the church's social responsibilities. And he was also an energetic spokesman for the church on issues of public interest. He really believed that the church should speak to every area of life and not be afraid to address every area of life, particular, even if it's politics or economics or sociological things, the church had something to say about all of those things. And I think that had a real impact on the church in Scotland in his day. And I think it's fair to say that where we as Christians have continued to embrace those views, that we should be thankful to Thomas Chalmers for having helped point us in the right direction.
So, my sister's favorite sermon by Chalmers is The Expulsive Power of a New Affection. That shows that the only way to overcome love for worldly things is by finding a stronger love for God. Do you have a favorite sermon by Chalmers?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that particular sermon because it is a wonderful sermon. My favorite Chalmers sermon is one that he preached on Ecclesiastes 4, verse 13, which says, "Better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice." That's the text. In the sermon, Chalmers recognizes that for people to change, there needs to be conversion. There needs to be moral reformation that Chalmers himself had experienced. And if we want the world to change, Thomas Chalmers says, then people need to change. And let me just read you a quote from that sermon. "The gospel is the great instrument for elevating the poor. Let the testimony of God be simply taken in, that on his own Son he has laid the iniquities of us all. Jesus Christ died, the just for the unjust, to bring us to God. This is a truth which, when all the world shall receive it, all the world will be renovated. Many do not see how a principle so mighty in operation should be enveloped in a proposition so simple of utterance. But let a man by his faith in this utterance come to know that God is his friend, and that heaven is the home of his fondest expectation. And in contact with such new elements as these, he will evince the reach and the habit and the desire of a new creation. It is this doctrine which is the alone instrument of God for the moral transformation of our species." I just think that's an amazing quote. It captures the gospel, and it captures the fact that the gospel changes people's lives. And when people's lives are changed, then society is changed.
Goosebumps, man. That's awesome. Oh man, that's a really cool
I know
quote.
every time I read that, I just feel, yeah, goosebumps is the right word.
It's just invigorating, man. If we want society to change, we must be the first people to change. We can't be hypocrites talking about, oh, I wish this would change. Oh, you should start doing the right thing when
Yep.
you should look at yourself and find out what you're doing wrong.
Yep.
Last question. If you had a chance to meet Thomas Chalmers, what would you ask him?
Wow. I think the thing that I would ask him is, how did you maintain such a positive outlook in your life and in your ministry when you were faced with all the challenges that he was faced? And I think I know that his answer would be, by the grace of God. But if you read his life story, there were so many situations where his workload was totally overwhelming. He faced major health challenges. He faced huge opposition from people both in and outside the church, and yet he stayed focused. So that's I want to hear from his lips how he managed to do what he did. It's his example to us is something that I think we can still learn from in the 21st century.
Well, Mr. Finlayson, we're so thankful that you agreed to spend this time with us and answer our questions.
Thank you very much for having me. I've really enjoyed meeting you all, and I just pray that all of us will continue to serve the Lord in a way which brings glory to Him.
Listeners, if you'd like to be entered into a drawing to win a book by Mr. Finlayson, Chief Scottish Man, The Life and Ministry of Thomas Chalmers, published by Evangelical Press, go to our website, kidstalkchurchhistory.org, where you'll find the link. The book is accessible for teens, but might be enjoyed by the whole family. We also want to let you know about a great new scripture memory plan for kids, created by the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. Be sure to check it out at reformedresources.org. In partnership with the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, and on behalf of my co-hosts Grace and Sean, I'm Linus. Thank you for listening to Kids Talk Church History.